Everyone. People are just starting to stream into the webinar. It's noon here in Eastern US, broadcasting from Western Massachusetts, actually. Um, and uh, and it's good to see so many people signed up for this webinar today. Um, very excited about this discussion about citizens' assemblies and Lottocracy and House of Lords possibly becoming a House of Citizens and interesting developments in democracy that are so desperately needed at this time. So thank you for joining us. My name's Josh Wachtel, and I'm the Communications Director for Building a New Reality. This is the start of a series of webinars, the True Representation series, which we'll be doing over several months or even a little bit longer. So now that you're signed up to this webinar, we're going to keep you in the loop and keep you in the queue for the upcoming webinars that we're offering. It's always great to see where people are coming from. So if you want to use the chat function, which you'll find depending on your computer system, probably on the bottom of the screen. And if you click on the chat, and let me make sure I have that open so that everyone is able to chat. There we go. And you want to click, probably you want to click the blue button that says to everyone. So just let us know where you're coming from, and if you have professional affiliation with citizens' assemblies, we would welcome that as well. Uh, uh, Great to see San Francisco, Italy, Germany, Bucks County, Pennsylvania, Guatemala, Cyprus, Fargo, North Dakota, Munich, Germany, and the list goes on. The Netherlands. All right. Well, it's really, really, really wonderful to have an international audience for this. Um, and I just want to say that our upcoming webinars, May 14th, we're going to be doing a session about political depolarization, preventing family feuds, and we'll be announcing the guests for that shortly, uh, very, very soon after this webinar. And we're going to do another one on June 25th. Which is going to focus on citizens' assemblies on the rise around the world. Um, so we'll be letting you know about those, and you'll be getting links and so forth. Um, for today, we are really pleased to have two wonderful guests with us. Alex Guerrero is a professor of philosophy at Rutgers, and he has recently published a book that was at least 10 years in the making, Lottocracy, Democracy Without Elections. And he has laid out a whole envisioned really a system of governance that would be based on choosing people randomly. So we're going to be hearing about that. And we will also be hearing from Brett Hennig, who is the director of the Sortition Foundation. And Brett is working in Europe, really around the world, and also focused specifically on a campaign to reform the House of Lords in the United Kingdom to be a House of Citizens. So he is going to be talking about that as well. Um, all right. So again, welcome to this Building a New Reality webinar. We called it Lottocracy versus Sortition. And we're going to kick it off with Banner founder Ted Wachtel right now with a little bit of an overview before we hear from the other guests. And then we will have some panel discussion. And if you'd like to say after the hour's up, we're going to put a Zoom link in for a post-webinar small group discussions. All right, Ted.
Uh, so Josh is going to put up, I just have a few slides to accompany this, but I'd like to briefly frame our purposes here tonight and just talk initially the Banner Foundation, or Building a New Reality Foundation, for the last 10 years has been exploring promising possibilities for more effectively meeting society's needs. And we've defined our society's needs, Josh, if you'll, into 6 facets of the new reality: learning, governance, care, justice, enterprise, and spirit. And of course, tonight we're focused on governance, if you will, Josh. So our governance needs are apparent. In the United States, the polarization and anger and craziness of electoral conflicts has overwhelmed us. It's just, people are feeling terrible, even the people who won, because nobody's feeling good about each other. And all kidding aside, our event next month is about helping to prevent family feuds. It's become a real need in America. But around the world, democracy just is not working very well. And so we focus on governance now for the next few sessions, if you will, Josh. So I defined my own thoughts on governance in a book called True Representation in 2020. True Representation: How Citizens' Assemblies and Sortition Will Save Democracy. And for those of you who are new to this, sortition is simply democratic lottery, or the kind of random selection done in jury selection. My own background, if you'll move to the next slide, Josh, has been in the area of restorative practices. Restorative practices are, you might say, democracy in everyday life. The fundamental hypothesis that I wrote back in 1999 is that human beings are happier, more cooperative and productive, and more likely to make positive changes in their behavior when those in positions of authority do things with them rather than to them or for them. Would you move to the next slide? So all of these restorative practices are meant to be ways of resolving various kinds of conflicts, resolving harm, but where people enter the room at odds with each other and hopefully come out with some level of resolution and having made whatever decisions are necessary. So in the early years of my experience, this was based on, for example, affective statements and affective questions might be used with a couple of kids on the playground to resolve a conflict. You could move up to impromptu conferences or group of circles and larger needs, a whole classroom or a workplace group or circle. And the formal conferences were what was called restorative justice. And this was a very formal way of responding to usually crime, wrongdoing in a school, a serious incident, where you would bring together 10 to 20 people who were at odds and who would come out hopefully with some decisions and some resolution. But it was in the last decade, as I became increasingly aware of things like community processing and citizens' assemblies, that I realized we could take it from the micro level to the macro level, to large group decision-making processes that dealt with divisive issues in large institutions, corporations, whole cities, states, and nations. Next slide, Josh. So the man who wrote the book on large group decision-making, as far as I'm concerned, is James Surowiecki. He, at one time, was the financial writer for the, excuse me, for the New Yorker magazine. But he wrote this book in 2004 about, why the many are smarter than the few and how collective wisdom shapes business, economies, societies, and nations. And it was named the best business book of 2004 by both Forbes and Businessweek, two prominent business media in the United States. Uh, but basically, I came away with one set of major takeaways. What are the 5 essentials for good large group decision making? Now, Sarah Wilke put a lot of emphasis on trust and cooperation as being essential. And the first two speak to the whole question of trust. You need to have an agreed upon and trusted process for converting individual opinions into a group decision. 2, you need trusted sources of reliable information. And finally, the decision makers themselves, they must be diverse, they must have independence of judgment, and decision-making process must be decentralized. So I won't speak for the whole world, but I suspect legislatures outside the US would reflect these things, but I'll speak from what I know. US politicians do not have any agreed upon and trusted process. They fight over the election process itself. And once they get to the legislature, they fight about the rules all the time. And in this era of fake news and alternative facts, nobody agrees on sources of information. In fact, it's been described as left and right living in their respective information bubbles. Finally, no, US legislators are not diverse. They're mostly white males over 50 with law or business backgrounds. And in terms of independence of judgment, they are in every legislature at a national or state level. They are pressured by party whips, and they are specifically pressured to support the policies of their political party's centralized leadership, which tends to indicate that they don't have decentralized political decision-making processes. So our legislatures don't meet any of the criteria for large group decision-making. And that's why we're here tonight. These two gentlemen have some suggestions to make about that. Thanks. Thanks, Josh.
Okay, great. Thanks, Ted. So at this time, I'm going to invite Alex Guerrero to join us and share his plan for a different form of governance, Lottocracy.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. And Ted and Josh, thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to get to speak to people who are interested in these issues. As Josh mentioned, I've been working on this book for, now probably something like 16 years, something. And so I'm very happy that it's finally out. If you're interested, I'll just put it in the chat. There's a whole website, Lottocracy.org, where I try to both talk some about the book, but also provide some slides that are available if you want to dig in deeper to the details. So the book really has 2 parts to it. The first part is raising a series of detailed worries about electoral representative democracy, particularly as it's functioning now under modern political conditions. So one of the things I try to highlight is that we live in a world where most of our political communities are these large polities, upwards of 5 or 50 million people. And that's going to create a whole set of challenges that might not be present everywhere or at all times when we try to think about governance structures. But so those background conditions, as I think of it, massive size and scale, that means that a lot of the political problems that we face that we need to try to address are going to be ones that are highly complicated. So trying to fix the healthcare system, it's not going to be a simple thing. It's not going to be the kind of thing that everybody will have immediate, ideas of exactly what we ought to do. And so that's going to create, one set of challenges for us trying to work together to address our political problems. So the kind of size and scale and the attendant complexity of the issues that we face, I think means that we see a lot of ignorance, not because people aren't smart or aren't capable, but just because the time and investment it would take to really get into the weeds, figuring out good policy is quite difficult. And I think what that means in a straightforward way in a lot of places is a breakdown in the mechanism of electoral accountability. So elections were supposed to be our way of holding our elected officials meaningfully accountable so that when they go off to, the seats of government, they will be acting on our behalf. I think that mechanism is really broken down as we no longer have enough of a detailed understanding of what they're doing, what the issues are, what would actually make for good policy. And it becomes easy for them to kind of pitch a whole bunch of things to us that in fact aren't advancing our interests and aren't helping us solve our problems together. So in the first half of the book, I try to trace out a bunch of different worries that I have about electoral representative systems. So just briefly, so one is because of this breakdown in accountability, we see a lot of capture where powerful interests come in and they're basically controlling the government rather than helping us all work together. We get capture by special interests. Another big issue is kind of the mass media environment and the way in which I think many people are manipulated by both traditional media and social media controlled now by, an elite of a different kind who have their own interests in trying to manipulate us. So when we go out into the world and try to learn about politics and what we ought to do, rather than having a few common epistemic sources that are both high quality and relatively centralized so that we all sort of share something like the same background picture of the world, we've become massively fragmented. First with cable news creating market segmentation, but now with social media driving that even further so that we're more and more occupying echo chambers and epistemic bubbles where what we learn about the world is really not what everyone is learning about the world. And so it becomes much harder to see common problems and work together. I think elections also create division where none need exist. So they kind of heighten our attention on those issues where we're most divided and try to build kind of support for their side by casting aspersion on the other side. And so I think that kind of manufactured division has again made it very hard for us to work together as a political community. Additionally, elections concentrate attention on the very short term. So rather than thinking about political problems with a longer time horizon, elected officials try to do those things they can get credit for in the really short term. And anyone who raises a longer term worry will be sort of maligned, and people will say, look, we don't actually have to impose this kind of regulation or this onerous tax. There's no need for it. The problem they're gesturing at is made up. And it'll be very hard to combat that given the background ignorance. So I think this is one of the ways in which our electoral system has done so poorly with respect to addressing climate change because it's a problem with a long time horizon. And then finally, sort of picking up something that Ted referenced, elections select an elite. So going back to Aristotle and the Athenians, there was the suggestion that if you want oligarchy, you use elections. If you want democracy, you use lottery selection. And so I think this is something that we've largely lost sight of. And rather than electing a genuine microcosm to have political power, we skew things in all kinds of ways. So both along race and class lines, but also in terms of occupation and education and life experience, the people who end up serving in power are not at all representative. And I think in many cases, they're very remote from the actual problems of the day. So many of them won't have known people personally who have been homeless or incarcerated or dealing with immigration issues or lacking health care or having to work 3 jobs while raising a child as a single parent. Those are not the people who end up with political power. And so, again, as a result, I think we see all kinds of skew and distortion in the electoral system. So first part of the book, kind of documenting these problems. I try to go through in a lot of empirical detail. So I'm a philosopher by training. I also have a law degree. I've tried to draw on all the relevant political science and psychology and media studies and other academic discussions of these issues that I can. The focus ends up being on political communities somewhat like the United States, partly because that's the case I know best, partly I'm drawing on research relevant to the United States. But the hope is in sketching in this first part, the kind of thoroughgoing criticism of electoral representative systems, that then we're kind of left with a question like, okay, what do we do now? And so in one of the chapters, chapter 7, the kind of pivot chapter of the book, I talk through some possible more modest solutions to this. So addressing public financing of campaigns, trying to think about term limits and whether they'd be better, thinking about media reform. Ultimately, I worry that none of those are actually going to do enough to address some of the core fundamental issues. And so then in the second half of the book, consider the use of lottery selection. In one of the initial chapters in that part, I raised the question, well, could we add a supplement to an electoral system? So rather than having a whole new system, imagine, say, a bicameral legislature with one of the two chambers selected by lottery, the other selected by election, or imagine adding a fourth branch of government, that, the people's branch, that would be selected by lottery to go alongside the legislature and the executive and the judicial branch. So those proposals have been raised by many people, and I think they're very interesting and very promising. The worry I have about them is that, given the concerns I raised in the first part of the book about elections, I worry having electoral structures anywhere within the system will bring a lot of the pathologies of elections into the system. So if you have a bicameral legislature where each side has to sign off on some piece of legislation, you're going to bring in all the, special interest capture and short-term bias and kind of elite structure on the election side, and that'll then serve as a bottleneck or veto point for any good ideas that might be developed by the randomly chosen citizens. So that's a worry I have. And I think one of the interesting conversations that I hope emerges today is sort of how to think about that. And some of that might come down to institutional design. What powers do we give each of these chambers, and how do we think about their role in the system? Is it going to be a kind of, accountability check? Is it going to be an oversight body? Is it going to have, a share in actual lawmaking? Other options also out there. But so what I want to do, and what I try to do in the second part of the book at length, is think about what it would look like if we were to drop elections out entirely. Is there a system that we could imagine that both seems like it might do well at actually making good policy, good governance, that would look suitably democratic in the right way, so that we would feel it respects the various things we care about when we think about political equality or political power or right to participate in government? But then also thinking about how institutionally we might design it so that it could actually make good decisions using randomly chosen people. And so second half of the book goes through a lot of different ideas in that regard, sort of trying to spell out the system. The basics of the system, as I try to defend it, are first setting out, rather than having a generalist legislature, to instead imagine a network of something like 20 different single issue legislative bodies, each focused on a different policy area. So lots of questions about how to divide all the issues into policy areas. But the basic idea here is, rather than creating this massive task where you take randomly chosen people and all of a sudden expect them to be able to learn about all these different issues in a relatively short period of time, instead focus their attention on one big policy area. And the hope would be that makes the task a bit more manageable. It also means we'd avoid having some issues that get left to the shadows because of the way elections are structured. Many topics don't see very much light at all in terms of discussion. We can see cases where both parties seem to be colluding on that issue. So the single issue structure has other virtues, but one of the big ones is making it so that ordinary people who might not have thought about the issue before could manageably get up to speed in a short period of time. So single issue legislative bodies, people serving on them would be chosen at random. So I envision a system where there'd be 450 people on each of these, and 150 people rotating in each year, serving 3-year terms. And so people would serve a substantial amount of time. My hope is that, we would pay people well for doing this work, so that actually it would be in their interest. They'd be incentivized to participate. And we could do that, maybe paying them 110% of their current income, or imagine some floor where we pay everyone a set amount. But the hope would be to make sure that people were not discouraged from participating by their life circumstances. So we'd need to make sure that employment protections were in place, that people could defer if this were a particularly hard time for them, given their family or career obligations. So lots of details we could get into there. But so lottery selected, 450 people serving on each of these single issue legislative bodies, covering different policy areas. Then from there, the structure might be familiar to people who know something about the discussion of citizens' assemblies or citizen juries or civic assemblies. So the basic structure is, a kind of learning phase where people would hear about different ideas from experts, but also advocates and stakeholders, where they would come in and make presentations about what issues need to be addressed, what loopholes need to be closed, what problems there are within this particular policy space. So if you're working on the single issue legislative body focused on education or agriculture or energy, you'd hear a number of different ideas about, okay, here are things we should focus on, raised by both experts, but also by advocates. So I think in the background, you'd see new organizations of political advocacy now trying to speak to these randomly chosen citizens, but also focused on particular issues rather than in broad political party structure. And so with the randomly selected people who are now empowered to do this, they would then have extended periods of deliberation and discussion as they work through different ideas about what to do with respect to these particular policy issues. There'd also be mechanisms of community engagement and community consultation, where the randomly chosen people could interact with the broader community, places where they were from. They could go back and hold town hall meetings trying to hear about, well, here's what we're thinking about. What do you all think about that? You could use lots of background mechanisms of various kinds of polling and information gathering. At the end of this long process, the randomly chosen citizens in these single issue legislative bodies would be empowered to directly enact legislation. So that's a big difference than a lot of the other models. And this would be a way in which kind of the electoral system would be set entirely to the side. A question that often comes up is sort of, well, that describes the legislative branch. What about the executive? I also defend a similar kind of view with respect to the executive. So getting rid of the unitary elected executive, I think for many reasons it's been a disaster. Far too much accumulation of power in that one office, at least in the United States case. I talk some about parliamentary systems or Westminster style systems that operate differently. I think both have significant problems. So the book doesn't focus on the executive, but imagines a world in which the executive function would also be conducted by a kind of disaggregated network of randomly chosen citizens, maybe along with some people who are in their position via appointment by other randomly chosen citizens. Won't get too into the weeds of all those details. Let me just finish up by saying a big question that people might have about these kinds of institutions. One is, would they perform well? So I try to make the case that they would, that they'd avoid various kinds of distortion, short-term thinking, elitism in how they work through issues. I think they'd help to overcome a lot of the division and discord. You bring people together, have them interact in a kind of nice way, respectful way about hard issues, and you can see a lot of progress and a lot of improvement in how they're thinking about things, not just in terms of what they decide, but rebuilding relationships with people as you start to see common cause and trying to work on places and things where we agree. I think also when we ask the question, would this kind of system count as democratic? So I try in the book to defend the view that they would, basically arguing that this better reflects our real commitment to political equality, the idea that any one of us should be able to govern, any one of us should be appropriately given political power, and then thinking about, in particular, how little power we have under the system now and how non-equal or inegalitarian the political system is now. I also try to talk through ways in which our political participation now isn't particularly efficacious. Many people feel alienated and like they don't actually have power in the system. True, in most places, you get to vote, but do you actually have power beyond that? And do you feel like you're voting for real options? Do you feel like your vote actually is holding anyone effectively accountable? And so lots of worries on that front. I think with randomly chosen people working on particular issues, everybody would have a chance to think about, well, what do they care about, and build advocacy efforts around those ideas rather than just on trying to get a particular person elected. So for many reasons, I think this system might actually do better and be more of a real democracy than what we have now. And the final chapter of the book thinks about how might we get there to this kind of system from here. And the basic idea there is really focusing on building knowledge about these institutions, trying to get people more familiar with sortition and random selection and citizens' assemblies, and in a way seeing that as a kind of way station on the way to building comfort and support and consent for a system that might work more in the full-blown Lottocracy sense, and also a chance to learn along the way. How are things working well, what has worked well for citizens' assemblies, what are places where we might run into trouble or concern, especially as more power is turned over to these bodies. We'll expect, and we should expect, to see more efforts to capture them and distort the outcomes. And in the book, I try to talk about ways of trying to safeguard against that. But thank you very much. I look forward to the conversation. And yeah, please take a look at the book if you're interested. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Alex. Yeah, and so in terms of how we get there and raising awareness, that's what we're trying to do at Banner. And I'd like to invite Brett Hennig now, who's also involved in the reality of citizens' assemblies and advocating for their greater use in the UK and around the world.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Ted. Thanks, Alex. Very interesting, provocative discussion. I'm a co-founder director of the Sortition Foundation. We campaign for the institutionalization of citizens' assemblies because, as all the reasons that Alex laid out for the use of lottery or of sortition as its technical name is actually happening right now in citizens' assemblies all across the world. I can pop various links into the chat if they're useful, but citizens' assemblies, in the sense of selecting by lottery a group of people to discuss political issues, has now happened probably 1,000 times around the world in the last couple of decades. And they've started at local level, but they're moving up, and we're now seeing them, for example, at EU level. So I'll pop a link in the chat there about European citizens panels. So at European level, they've now had about 7 or 8 of these sorts of panels, starting with the Conference on the Future of Europe. The last one, which just met last weekend, 150 people randomly selected from all across Europe to talk about the EU's next long-term budget. So they're giving them an important say in various elements. There has been a global assembly held on the climate crisis. There's another link in the chat. That was a few years ago, and they are trying to run more of them. And of course, many local citizens' assemblies. The most famous poster child of national citizens' assemblies are the Irish citizens' assemblies. Ireland is essentially just having a whole series of ongoing national citizens' assemblies where they select by lottery a representative sample of people and get them to talk about really knotty political issues: the constitutional ban on abortion, same-sex marriage, drug policy, climate change, really controversial, difficult topics. Other countries in Europe are following the Irish lead. The Germans, there's another link in the chat there, just held a national citizens assembly. That was on nutrition in transition. Less controversial perhaps, but still very impressive to see a national government take these ideas on board. The UK had a climate assembly several years ago. There's another link. Talking about the climate crisis in the UK, which was sponsored by commissioned by the UK Parliament, and it is very impressive. Of course, the vast majority of citizens' assemblies happening around the world happen at local level, simply because there's far more local councils or city councils around the world. But in the OECD publication that I've also just popped in the chat, they list these hundreds of citizens' assemblies that have happened around the world. Quite a few in Japan, quite a few in South Korea, many in Australia, and hundreds in Europe as well. So, I mean, what this shows to me is that the idea works, and even the elites trust or they use this tool, citizens' assemblies, to try to address topics that they feel unable to address. So, for example, Macron in France, after the Yellow Vest protests against a rise in diesel fuel tax, which was an attempt to tackle the climate crisis, he tried to diffuse the Yellow Vest protest by proposing to have a National Climate Assembly. That was a very successful assembly in the sense of they came up with very sensible, great proposals. It was very unsuccessful in the sense that the French Parliament then proceeded to more or less ignore or completely reject those proposals from the citizens chosen by sortition. We're also seeing them happen in North America. Here's another link in the chat of Mass LBP. They've held many citizens, they call them citizens panels, in Canada. In fact, in about 2004 was the first major citizens panel, and that was held in Canada. Healthy Democracy in the States, there's another link, held a citizens panel, was it last year, I think, on how to develop the fairgrounds in Petaluma in California. So there are even sparks of these kinds of events happening in the US, and we'd love to see more of those happening over there, of course. Now, the main problem with citizens' assemblies, as I see it today, is, okay, we know they work. We know that you can select by lottery a randomly represented group of people. You can put them through an informed delivery process. They come up with sensible, fair, impressive proposals. But, yep, great, thanks. I was just seeing the chat. The main problem is, of course, that elected governments can then ignore their proposals, or they can cherry pick the ones that they like. And in fact, this is precisely why the Sortition Foundation is engaged in campaigning to make this sort of style of event institutionalized, so to speak. And what our main campaign in the UK is being labelled the 858 campaign, and that is, there's a link in the chat again, is to propose that we replace the House of Lords in the UK with a permanent citizens' assembly, if you like. And this would guarantee that citizens' assemblies have, direct and real political power. Is it enough political power? That's an open question, and I'm happy to engage on that. The model and the reason why we launched that campaign is for various fairly obvious reasons. One is that the House of Lords in the UK is immensely unpopular. Obviously, it's this sort of dinosaur hangover of aristocratic times. And when you do any sort of polling, you see that everyone typically hates the House of Lords and thinks they're doing an atrocious job. The second one was that the new government in the UK, the Labour government, had in their mandate to replace the House of Lords with a more representative body. So we see that there's this sort of open political possibility of institutionalizing a sort of permanent citizens' assembly in the UK. There are examples already of permanent citizens' assemblies existing. There's been one set up in the region of East Belgium, which is a German-speaking region. They set up the Permanent Citizens Assembly before COVID, so it got a bit knocked about by COVID. It sort of went into hibernation for a year while we were dealing with that. But it's still there. The Permanent Assembly exists as a sort of alongside the elected chamber there in East Belgium. So to promote this sort of replace the House of Lords with a House of Citizens, we also think that one idea would be to create a local permanent citizens assembly in the UK. So we've also campaigning actively in Manchester, which has a history of sort of political radicalism or political innovation, to set up a permanent sort of citizens assembly there in Manchester. Our sort of theory of change is that no political change of this magnitude has ever happened or will ever happen without a mass social movement on the street. If you look from the sort of Chartists in the early 1800s demanding male suffrage to the suffragettes demanding female suffrage, to the civil rights movement in the US demanding equal votes for people of color in the US. The history books to us tell us we need a mass social movement if we want to get anywhere with this kind of project. And so that's our main strategy, is to engage in first digital mobilization, so trying to build a large number of people online who can advocate for this. And then in, for example, Manchester, start off with some actual on-street mobilization, start to see if we can get an organizing strategy going, demanding this kind of change. In fact, hopefully towards the end of the year, we'll actually have a large-scale demonstration in the UK. We're modelling it on the suffragettes' rush on Parliament. Hopefully that'll happen in September, October, where we will have tens of thousands of people on the street demanding that the House of Lords be replaced with the Citizens' Assembly. Maybe I'll leave to the discussion about why we are campaigning for an accompanying chamber and not campaigning merely to throw away your right to vote and only go straight to elections, even if in the book I've written, which is called The End of Politicians, I advocate for exactly that. So it's a strategic decision from our part, in a sense, about what is possible now. I sort of assume that every place in any place on the planet where this happens, it will be sort of informed by the historical, cultural background of that place. And just like every electoral system is very different across the world, I assume that every sort of implementation of the use of lottery or sortition in the future will potentially be very different. And I'm open to those number of changes. So I think I'll happily leave it there and open up for the discussion, because I'm very interested in hearing what other people have to say and having that debate. Thanks, Josh.
All right. Thanks, Brett. And I'm going to invite Ted and Alex to put their screens on. Do you guys want to respond to that? I mean, I think what Brett's saying is very consistent with our view, my view anyway. You know, like this is going to happen different ways, and we're going to, you know, we citizen the title for this webinar was, we knew there's a contradiction in dreaming about getting rid of all politicians and elections and just having, and then the reality of the steps you have to go through to get there. But I don't know, maybe Alex, do you want to comment on that?
No, yeah, I think the disagreement between us is very small.
Yeah.
Maybe non-existent. I think there's often a question of, what will inspire people, and I think there's two really different routes. I think one is to get a kind of big different view and sort of get people excited around that. Another is to have them actually experience something and actually take part in it, or know people who have and see it work. And I think in a way both of those are important. And as Brett suggested, I think getting people to know about it, but also getting people out there, and the more people see people out there, I think it makes all the difference. There's an interesting there's a new book. So I'm in the academic world rather than in the organizer or advocate or activist world. But sort of in that space, I think there hasn't been enough yet discussion of using sortition, using random selection. So you can read a lot of democratic theory that writes about, elections as if we're in a totally different world than the one we're actually in. I think that's starting to change. But there's already some pushback. So there's a new book called The Lottocratic Mentality by Christina Lafont and Nadia Urbanati that's very much saying there's a pernicious thing happening, this use of sortition or moving away from elections. It's troubling. We should be worried about it. And I think it's important to engage with those ideas. And I've been on many panels now with both of them, and they're wonderful, and I think very committed to a lot of the same ideals, but they're questions of implementation. And I think one of their big objections has been too much of the push for sortition has come in a kind of technocratic way, almost leaving the people out of it. And I think one of the really exciting things about the Sortition Foundation and the kind of recent campaign especially is it's really not that. It's not some group of academic or technocratic people sort of sitting in a room somewhere designing a system that then is going to be forced on everyone. It's just trying to get these ideas in view. So for me, that's really exciting, and I think is definitely a necessary step to building both kind of public consciousness around these things, but also the right kind of support for them. I don't think anything ever works if you don't have most people behind it. Yeah.
Right. Ted.
Josh, I really support the whole idea of finding ways for people to experience these kinds of events, and either literally being them or able to observe them in a regular and meaningful way. In the movement I've been involved with, restorative practices, 25, 30 years ago, that was the strategy we adopted. We would invite people into our schools and group homes to, people would say, geez, I never saw kids talk to each other this way. And that experience excited people. And I think we can do a similar, even if some of them are simulations where people just get together to try it out. But what people experience with each other and their change, it builds community. It actually, the idea of arguing, but in a respectful way and coming to decisions, builds bonds. That's my point.
Yeah, go ahead, Brett.
Yeah, so in Ireland, which is the country where they've had the most national citizens' assemblies, just having regular national citizens' assemblies, the first few citizens' assemblies, of course, no one knew what they were, and everyone was dubious and skeptical. But now that they've been doing them for like a decade or more, and maybe half the population now, actually, if you say the word citizens' assemblies, they go, oh yeah, that's that thing that did this. You're just seeing incredible levels of trust in these citizens' assemblies. And what you also see is a much higher response rate actually to participate in them, because they're not compulsory, of course. You send an invitation to a group of people selected by lottery, and some subset of those people who receive those invitations respond. And there's a huge skewing in who responds, of course, which is another whole discussion we could have. But in Ireland, they're seeing much higher response rates than elsewhere in the world, and you're seeing much higher levels of trust. In terms of the strategic question about, should you have a dual system or not, it seems, well, I think a campaign to eliminate people's right to vote is dead in the water. I think there is no way that you will get a mass campaign of people on the street saying, yes, take away my right to vote. Like, I just can't see that happening. Whereas I can see it happening saying, yes, let's create a second chamber. Okay, in the future, if we have a country where there are two chambers, and you can then compare the behavior, the way that legislation travels through a sortition chamber and then travels through an elected chamber, and the ping pong back and forth, and you can see that everyone in the sortition chamber believes and agrees as I do, but people in the elected chamber are busy arguing because of all their problems. I think at that stage we could launch a campaign to eliminate the elected chamber. I think before that, there's just no way, personally, that I could see a campaign being successful. Even if I actually do agree with Alex, and I do believe that we would be better governed by a pure sortition system, it's not, I don't think it's a winnable campaign at this point in history, so to speak.
I want to, there's a couple questions they're in the chat or in the Q&A. One is asking about noticing that the spaces around this kind of democracy are not so diverse. At least somebody's perception of that. Another is talking about overcoming entrenched economic interests. I mean, and I guess one of the things I've seen is, I can think of a lot of issues where I say, well, that issue should be a citizens' assembly, or that one. But it's like, how do you get the advocates of these things to, stop advocating for the thing they're advocating for and say, okay, we're going to change the process? It's like, I don't know, and I don't know if that's one of the reasons why we're not seeing the diversity yet. But do you guys, Alex, I see you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So the question sort of, well, I'll take the first one, then the other, and then I think they are related. So this worry that, like, is the space around these issues, sortition, overwhelmingly white and male? I think in some ways I would say no. Like the main other person I'm always on panels with is Elan Landemore, who is political theorist at Yale. And like I said, I'm always arguing with Christina Lafont and Nadia Urbanati, but they're all women, but they're also kind of all established academics. And so that space is one space, and I think it inherits some of the same background differences. So I'm one of the only Hispanic philosophers ever to publish or ever to be on a bunch of journals. The U.S. is very bad on this front. Some professions, some academic sorts are really bad. But I think it's also something the community has taken note of. I'm not a central person on the advocacy organizing side, but I'll just put in the chat. I had the chance to attend the Democracy R&D kind of series of workshops back in Vancouver, and they've been very much working with people all around the world. And in particular, there's the South North Learning group and project where really trying to just put it in the chat, think about ways in which, different places have different issues, and we might be able to learn in important ways about how things ought to be done differently in different places. So I think it's a great question to press on. The other thing I'll say about sort of how do we avoid entrenched economic interests. So there's a lot of strategies that I would describe as kind of getting the thin end of the wedge in there and then like trying to get more in eventually. So one is, I think, are there some issues where there's broad acknowledgement that we need to do something differently? We need to address this in a different way. And in a lot of cases, the elected officials don't actually want to have people don't actually want to be directly involved. And so they might be happy turning things over to a citizens assembly that could take on the issue and in some ways leave their hands clean with respect to what it ends up getting done. So that's one place. And then the hope is sort of, as Brett was suggesting, the more we have these around, people will come to view them favorably and be impressed with how they work. And it'll be harder and harder to taint them or indict them as undemocratic, given how they operate in the details. So another thing I've heard said is that some of the best advocates for sortition and citizens' assemblies are actually the people themselves who have served on them, who were randomly chosen and then become, wonderful advocates where they can talk about their experience, what they came in worried about, and what it actually was like in the detail. And so I think that's another place where trying to get ideas out is always difficult, right? So the more, it starts to look as a way of addressing economic entrenchment and oligarchy, any ideas are going to start getting pressure. But I think this is one place where if a lot of different people in a lot of different places raise their voices and say these are working well, that becomes harder, I think, to push against.
Do you want to add anything, Brett?
I mean, the diversity in our little room of four here is obviously
right.
not very strong. It
Yeah.
is not very diverse at all. And as Alex says, Democracy R&D is a great event with people from all over the world, and seeing it spread into South America. I mean, Africa is the one continent where there's not much in terms of traditional citizens' assemblies or traditional that we know. But what's more amazing to me is actually the diversity in the room of these citizens' assemblies. This is what's truly incredible. At the European citizens panels, they're requiring 33% of the people to between 16 and 25. And so there's just such a youth voice. And of course, you get exact gender balance in the room. Of course, you stratify on socioeconomic, so you get lower socioeconomic groups in the room, higher economic groups in the room. In the UK, they stratify on ethnicity. So the microcosm that you see looks like the community that you look at if you took a cross section of UK community, and that to me is really fruitful and really important.
Okay. Let me take this another question. How can assemblies effectively choose experts who themselves are at risk of outside influence? So how do assemblies do this? I'm sure people are interested to know that because we know what we see on the news is not always representative and fair. So what's different about what happens in a citizens' assembly in terms of how they can suss out good information?
I can try to give you some practical examples. I mean, It's always a really interesting question to ask. How are the experts, so-called experts, pulled into a citizens' assembly? I mean, one main thing before answering that question, though, is to realize that people in a citizens' assembly are not just like, they're not just there to be filled up with experts' opinion. They engage, they deliberate, they ask these experts questions. There's a lot of mistrust. Of course, you select by lottery a group of citizens, and half of them won't trust experts. That's for sure. So there is this process of engaging with those experts. The traditional mode is to set up a steering board, of course, and to require that steering board to make sure that the diversity of expert views is represented, and to require the views that are represented to be, peer reviewed. Make sure it's not just someone coming in with their own idea that hasn't gone through some rigorous process of review. The more exciting experiments that I've seen is actually where they give that power to the Citizens Assembly itself and say, look, here's a potential range of views that you could hear from. Do you agree that that's the whole range of views? Okay, if you agree with that's the range of views that should be presented, here's a bunch of experts who might represent each of those views. Who do you want to hear from? And giving that power to the citizens' assemblies themselves. Yeah, to me, it's important to realize that these experts, though, they're on tap, but not on top, as they say. You can ask for their views, but you can also just ignore them. In terms of the types of questions that we find works really well in citizens' assemblies, it's not a yes/no question, typically. You want a question where there's like 5 different options, all with a positive side and a negative side, and you want to understand which trade-offs people are willing to accept. Okay, yes, if we want to reduce pollution, will you ban cars from the city centre, or will you put a fee on cars travelling through the city centre? Both of those things can reduce city pollution, but they'll have different effects on different groups of society. And so it's a matter of understanding which trade-offs are useful. I'll stop there.
All right. I see another question about use of this outside of political arena, cooperatives. I mean, this is something we're very interested in. What are the governance issues around education, around enterprise workplaces? Do you guys have any thoughts about that and its helpfulness in building the movement as well?
So we've worked with a pension fund on engaging with their members by lottery in a representative way, and how to invest the pension fund in a sustainable manner. That was super interesting to see that happen outside that field. We've worked with a few student unions at universities, actually engaging with Sortition to talk about student union problems. We are actively engaging with various organizations about if they want to try to use this internally. So it can be done. It's not a massive field for us at the moment, but I can see that, using deliberative democratic techniques across the field are very important. Sortition Foundation is a workers' co-op. That was the most democratic kind of structure we thought you could use to create a not-for-profit company that we are.
I'd like to see large corporations using Sortition to select at least a corporate council that in turn selects the board, rather than the current method, and having people picked. Well, if you have this many shares, that's your chance, versus this many shares, that's your chance of being picked. But everyone has a chance of being picked, even if they have 1 share. And anyway, I think there's a lot of interesting ways to open up to a more democratic systems. I think I see the time.
Yeah, well, I want to ask Alex just one more question. I was thinking about these policies that the different groups, the different legislators would do. What happens when there's obviously crossover for all these areas. Some of these issues are so big. Have you any thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, very much. So one of the things I talk about in the book, there's a whole chapter just on the use of single issue legislatures as an idea. And so I do talk about, could we combine election with single issue legislatures? And so I actually think in some ways, we have all this substructure with generalist legislatures. So currently, some bill is proposed. There's a parliamentarian in U.S. Congress who decides what's the bill about. And then depending on that one person's decision. It gets slotted to one of the different committees within, Congress. And, those are area topical committees on, agriculture, whatever it might be. And so we see this kind of structure, but there isn't very much transparency around it. And a lot of our politics and, political discussion isn't oriented around that kind of thinking. So in the book, I talked through, there'd be lots of ways. If you noticed, well, we're working on this, but there's this other thing, and that's being handled by this other group, there'd be mechanisms by which you could merge together for a legislative session, and both groups could kind of come together. You could also do what happens in Congress when there's a topic that straddles a few different areas. It might go first to one body and then go to the other one and then go get sent back to the first one. And you can have these kind of diachronic processes. So yeah, lots of interesting questions about how to set those up institutionally. And, I look in the book at sort of what's been done. Just really quickly on the outside politics, there's a lot of interesting work that's been done on so-called workplace democracy and thinking about how to build more democratic culture. One of the hard things is often, are we going to replicate elite structures within workplace settings? And so I think sortition and lottocratic institutions have a lot of potential there. If you're interested, there's a political theorist philosopher named Lisa Herzog who's just published a open access book that is excellent called Citizen Knowledge, and I'll just put that in the chat as well. Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, we've come a little bit over our hour. I want to thank Brett Hennig, Alex Guerrero so much for being with us.